Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions of the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 62. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 2 and 3 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of those things in which man's happiness consists and what is happiness. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. And we have no less than 16 articles in this episode, and so we'll have to move slightly more succinctly and quickly to cover everything in our usual time. Article 1, whether man's happiness consists in wealth. No. Whether it be natural wealth, such as food, clothing, cars, homes, etc., all of which is directed to support, assist the nature of man, or it be artificial wealth, such as dollars and cents, which is directed normally to procuring the items of natural wealth. Whether wealth be considered from the natural or artificial side, happiness cannot consist in wealth because wealth is always a means and happiness is an end. We do not want the dollar itself. We want what the dollar has the possibility of giving us in exchange for it. And so the dollar itself, artificial wealth, cannot be our last end. The same goes for natural wealth, food, clothing, shelter, etc., all of which is simply a means for supporting our nature, not the final end or goal of that nature, and therefore cannot be that in which our happiness consists. Now, granted, we could also consider that same list of items as a means not to supporting nature, but as a means to pleasure or honor, but we will see those considered in subsequent articles. Article 2, whether man's happiness consists in honor. What is honor? Deference to the person honored, Aquinas says. And the Latin here translated into deference in English is reverentium. So honor is a kind of deference or reverence towards the one honored, which is why this cannot be that in which happiness consists. Because strictly speaking, this is not in the person honored, but an act of the person honoring, and therefore cannot constitute happiness in the person honored. Honor is just the side effect or symptom of the one who is being honored already possessing some degree of happiness. We honor a man because that man already has a kind of blessedness or perfection or happiness. And since honor is an act not in the honored, but in the honoring towards someone who already has some degree of happiness, it cannot be that in which happiness itself consists. Article 3, whether man's happiness consists in fame or glory. What is fame or glory? Aquinas says it consists in being well known and praised. And thus we run into the same problem with being honored. Fame, like honor, is the effect of already possessing some good or semblance of happiness. If one's fan's judgment is true, because the judgment of others could also be false, as all of us probably know from experience, namely that a man be praised not because he is good and blessed, but only because he appears to be. However, whether a man's fame or glory is deserved or undeserved, it is still the effect or result of already possessing some kind of blessedness, happiness, and therefore cannot itself be that in which happiness consists. Article 4, whether man's happiness consists in power. What is power? It is the capacity to affect another or even nothingness, in the case of God creating the universe out of nothing. And all power consists in being able to do all things or elicit all possible effects, which would disqualify power as that in which happiness consists, because power is for the sake of some desired effect, and therefore it is a means, like money, not the goal. Plus, power, at least in this life, brings with it the anxiety of having to protect it. It also has the possibility of being used for good or ill for oneself or others, wherein that which gives us happiness must be our perfect and crowning good. And for these reasons and others, primarily because power is not a goal but a means to other goals, we must reject it as our last end. Article 5, whether man's happiness consists in any bodily good. Does happiness consist in physical beauty and strength, etc.? No, because happiness is not a bodily thing. The dog does not know happiness because it does not know at all. Our immaterial intellect allows us to reach a height of joy, a depth of sorrow that is simply inaccessible to irrational creatures. Rabbits don't throw themselves off bridges due to an existential crisis. Rabbits also have no notion of beatitude. All this to say that in man, the body is for the sake of our higher, unique faculties in the material world, namely the intellect and will. In the same way that the sailor doesn't steer the boat for the sake of the boat, but for the sake of arriving at his destination. And so we do not have a body for the sake of satisfying the body, but for assisting our intellect and will to attain happiness. Plus, all of us know people who have every bodily good and satisfaction of the flesh, whether in food or drink, who are not happy. Therefore, happiness does not consist in bodily good. Article 6, whether man's happiness consists in pleasure. Pleasure or delight, similar to honor and fame, if it be true, is the effect of possessing some good, and therefore cannot be the good itself, which once possessed elicits happiness. Think about the pleasure of eating a donut. Without the donut, there is no pleasure. And although it's true that delight and pleasure is not a means to us, for we desire pleasure and delight for its own sake, not for the sake of something else, which sadly makes it easy to mistake for our true and final good. However, delight and pleasure is still not that in which happiness essentially consists, because it is an effect of the good already attained. Rather, what we want to know in this question is, what precisely is the good, which once attained renders or affects in us complete delight, pleasure, i.e., happiness? Article 7, whether some good of the soul constitutes man's happiness. In this article, we receive an important distinction between what we call man's subjective and objective last end. As far as happiness itself is the end for which we are made, an effect in the subject, it is something that happens in us, and therefore we can say, from this perspective, from the subjective point of view, that happiness is indeed some good in the soul. Yet insofar as our goal or end is some object outside of us, which we do not possess, which once possessed can elicit in us happiness, from this objective perspective, then happiness is not something in the soul. It is something outside of the soul which we must attain or possess in order to have in the soul happiness. As a final note from this article, Aquinas begins to give away his hand on where we are ultimately headed with these questions in discovering what in fact can bring us happiness. He writes, "For that good which is the last end is the perfect good, fulfilling the desire. Now man's appetite, otherwise the will, is for the universal good. And any good inherent to the soul is a participated good, and consequently a portioned good. Therefore none of them can be man's last end," which fittingly brings us to our last article of this question, Article 8, whether any created good constitutes man's happiness. As the Catholic philosopher Father Clark wrote in his seminal work, The One and the Many, to recognize anything as finite is already implicitly to have reached beyond it, at least in desire. To recognize a prison as a prison is already to have reached beyond it in desire and imagination. As rational creatures, we naturally wonder as to the cause of whatsoever effect we have before us, which then leads us to wonder about the cause of those causes, which does not allow us to rest, at least in the intellect and will, until we have come to the knowledge of the ultimate or final cause of all things, which is God. Our will, which is the appetite following upon the intellect, wills or desires that which the intellect proposes to it. And so in knowing that there must be an ultimate cause, a universal good, a universal true, from which all these participated, limited goods must find their origin, we will naturally desire to know it as we are able. And Aquinas' words, basing his argument on the object of the intellect and will to truth and good in general, universal good and true, he writes, It is impossible for any created good to constitute man's happiness, for happiness lulls the appetite altogether, else it would not be the last end, if something yet remained to be desired. Now the object of the will, i.e. of man's appetite, is the universal good, just as the object of the intellect is the universal true. Hence it is evident that naught can lull man's will save the universal good. This is to be found not in any creature, but in God alone. And as an aside, these articles we have just covered in question 2 of the Prima Secundae are very famous and I do believe worth reading and meditating on from the text itself if one so desires. Now on to question 3, what is happiness? Article 1, whether happiness is something uncreated. In a word, insofar as the object of our happiness is God, yes, it is uncreated. But insofar as happiness is something which is affected in us, happiness is something created. Article 2, whether happiness is an operation. Is it an action? Is happiness an act? And since it is something in the intellect and will primarily, the attainment of God through knowledge and love of Him, then we can safely say that happiness is an act on our part. Moreover, since happiness is the supreme perfection of man, it must consist in the perfection of our most perfect faculties, which are perfected through knowing and willing the most perfect thing, which is, again, God. Lastly, and more broadly speaking, through experience, we can see that things attain their proper end through action. Stones gravitate, plants grow, animals eat and reproduce, and so it is with man that we also attain our perfect and crowning end through action. Article 3, whether happiness is an operation of the sensitive part or of the intellective part only. We do not know God by sensing Him, whether externally or internally, as it is written in the Gospel of John. No one has ever seen God. And just generally speaking, we do not know or understand anything with the senses. Knowledge is abstracted from the interior and exterior senses and takes place in the immaterial intellect. Therefore, happiness cannot consist essentially in the sensitive part of man. However, since we receive knowledge through the senses, then the senses do have a part to play in this imperfect happiness we can have of God in this life. Lastly, Aquinas on this article notes that on the last day, at the general resurrection, the sensitive part of man, once one partakes of a perfect happiness in a glorified state, will share an overflowing of that intellectual beatitude. In St. Thomas's words, at the resurrection, from the very happiness of the soul, as Augustine says, the body and the bodily senses will receive a certain overflow so as to be perfected in their operations, a point which will be explained further on when we treat on the resurrection. But then the operation whereby man's mind is united to God will not depend on the senses. Article 4, whether if happiness is in the intellective part, it is an operation of the intellect or of the will. In the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, as recorded in the Gospel of John, this is eternal life, that they may know Thee, the only true God. Happiness consists primarily in the knowledge of God, and then consequently in delight and rest, which results from that knowledge in the will, as summarized by Aquinas. The essence of happiness consists in an act of the intellect, but the delight that results from happiness pertains to the will. In this sense, Augustine says that happiness is joy in truth, because to wit, joy itself is the consummation of happiness. Article 5, whether happiness is an operation of the speculative or the practical intellect. As we covered in episode 41, the difference between these two, the speculative and practical intellect, is the following, as stated by Aquinas. For it is the speculative intellect which directs what it apprehends not to operation, but to the consideration of truth, while the practical intellect is that which directs what it apprehends to operation. The speculative differs from the practical in its end, whence each is named from its end. The one speculative, the other practical, i.e. operative. So these are terms we use to describe the one intellectual action, but as directed either to operation or to contemplation. And since our happiness consists in the contemplation of God, then in response to this article, we can say that happiness is an operation of the speculative intellect, not the practical. Article 6, whether happiness consists in the consideration of speculative sciences. Speculative sciences would include metaphysics, anthropology, physics, for example, which are all focused on the nature of things and not directed essentially towards practical matters or to action. So does our happiness consist in considering things like metaphysics? And I think anyone who has taken a metaphysics class can vouch for the fact that this is not the case. Aquinas argues that the speculative sciences derive their content from the material world and therefore can only extend so far when it comes to the knowledge of immaterial substances such as God, who we know exists, along with the selection of the divine attributes via the natural world, but cannot know much more beyond that. So insofar as the speculative sciences allow us to know something about God, they cause a kind of happiness in us. But insofar as such knowledge is imperfect, so too the happiness elicited from that knowledge is imperfect. In St. Thomas's words, it follows that man's happiness cannot consist in the consideration of speculative sciences. However, just as in sensible forms there is a participation of the higher substances, so the consideration of speculative sciences is a certain participation of true and perfect happiness. Article 7, whether happiness consists in the knowledge of separate substances, namely angels. And our compass in this question is the following words from Aquinas. Now it is evident that whatever is the perfection of a power is so, insofar as the proper formal object of that power belongs to it. Now the proper object of the intellect is the true. Therefore the contemplation of whatever has participated truth does not perfect the intellect with its final perfection. Since therefore the order of things is the same in being and in truth, whatever are beings by participation are true by participation. As we have covered in previous episodes, truth is conformity of mind to the thing, and since everything conforms to the mind of God who made it and sustains it, everything is true insofar as it has being, and therefore things that have a participated or limited being can also be said to have a participated truth, since truth is simply being as related to or conformed to some intellect. All this to say that since the proper object of the intellect is not some particular participated truth, but universal truth, it cannot be perfectly perfected until it beholds universal truth itself, that non-created, non-participated truth, which is only God. In this question, as well as in the previous one, we are talking about the difference between a perfect happiness and an objectively imperfect happiness. So back to our article, can knowing angels elicit a kind of happiness in us? Sure, but it is not perfect, as St. Thomas says. God alone is his being, his essence. It follows that contemplation of him makes man perfectly happy. However, there is no reason why we should not admit a certain imperfect happiness in the contemplation of the angels, and higher indeed than in the consideration of speculative sciences. And then to our last article, Article 8, whether man's happiness consists in the vision of the divine essence. In a sentence, St. Thomas says, final and perfect happiness can consist in nothing else than the vision of the divine essence. The key word in this article is perfect, in the phrase perfect happiness, because as the Catholic Church has defined, God could have called us to a happiness short of seeing God as he is, or the beatific vision, as it is written in the magisterial document titled Humani Generis from 1950. It says, others destroy the gratuity of the supernatural order, since God, they say, cannot create intellectual beings without ordering and calling them to the beatific vision. So God could have destined man to a lesser than the absolute highest happiness possible which is seeing God as he is without any injustice on his part. But going back to our article, Aquinas argues that perfect happiness must consist in the vision of the divine essence because of the reason he gave in Article 8 as well as Article 7. The argument from Article 8 of the last question was from the perspective of wonder, that whenever a man sees some effect, he wonders at the cause, and therefore he could not be perfectly happy until knowing the cause of all causes, and not only that he exists, but even what he is like in himself, which is what occurs in the vision of the divine essence. In St. Thomas's words, if therefore the human intellect, knowing the essence of some created effect, knows no more of God than that he is, the perfection of that intellect does not yet reach simply to the first cause, but there remains in it the natural desire to seek the cause, wherefore it is not yet perfectly happy. Then the argument from Article 7 of this question was from the nature of the intellect and will itself, that based on the proper object of both, only God himself could perfectly perfect them and therefore lead man to a perfect happiness. St. Thomas on this point writes, now the object of the intellect is what a thing is, i.e. the essence of a thing. Wherefore the intellect attains perfection insofar as it knows the essence of a thing. Consequently, for perfect happiness, the intellect needs to reach the very essence of the first cause, and thus it will have its perfection through union with God as with that object in which alone man's happiness consists. And for these two reasons, we must admit that the perfect happiness of man consists in the vision of the essence of God. Which brings us to a close of this episode. We have just finished covering questions 2 and 3 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of those things in which man's happiness consists, and what is happiness. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.